Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate. This is going to be really fun, folks. We have two guys who love philosophy. They love kind of thinking through these ethical issues in careful ways, and so they're very experienced. It's going to be a lot of fun. Want to let you know, though, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we have many more debates coming up. We are very excited. For example, at the bottom right of your screen, Steve McRae will be on tomorrow to hash out some personal issues with his son, Snake is Right. So that will be a very exciting one. We're a neutral channel. The thumbnail there on the bottom right of your screen is just a joke between Steve and I, but we do want to let you know we are a neutral channel. We don't have any stances. So whether you be Christian, atheist, Republican, Democrat, you name it, no matter what walk of life you're from, we do hope you feel welcome. And so with that, want to let you know I have put the links of the speakers in the description. So if you're listening today and you're like, I like that, you can hear plenty more by clicking on those links. Also, want to let you know we're going to have a kind of flexible kind of discussion where it's roughly 10 minutes opening from each side, followed by open discussion or conversation, and then Q&A. So if you have a question, fire it into the old live chat, and please remember to tag me with @ModernDayDebate. That'll make it easier for me to add every question to the list for the Q&A. Super chat is also an option, in which case we will basically bump your question or comment up to the top of the list for the Q&A. And Super Chat also allows you to make a comment toward one of the speakers, which of course they would get to respond to. So with that, without any further ado, we are very excited to have these guys here. I forgot to ask who is going to go first. That's up to you guys. And so I just want to say again, though, thanks so much for being with us today.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having me as well. If you want to go first, perspective, I think that'd probably be best.
Well, I haven't formally prepared anything. I wasn't necessarily sure of the format, and obviously I didn't know precisely the topic area. I knew we were talking about veganism. I'm not really familiar with your stance per se. I know obviously, arguing that veganism is not a moral obligation. So, if you'd like, I could give a brief opening on why I would argue why veganism is an ethical obligation, if you'd like. Yeah, okay. So I would say that veganism is an ethical obligation like any other ethical obligation, as in something which we do because it is the right thing to do. Now, what I mean by right is that we have an epistemological, an ethical and an epistemological obligation to commit the action or to be consistent within our actions, to be in our judgments. So, for example, if I was to say that murder is wrong, what I'm actually saying is that we have an obligation to not commit murder. When I say that we have an obligation to not commit murder, I'm not saying that you just shouldn't do it and that a God has given us a law, we follow that law, and therefore we come to some conclusion that we shouldn't kill people. What instead I'm saying is that based off fundamental human nature, that to commit murder actively harms us ourselves, and that because what we have in us is innate drives, innate goals, a telos, if you will, that it goes against our very will to commit murder. When I commit murder, what I'm doing is I'm actually destroying my epistemological ability to gain epistemic grounding. So in other words, I'm reliant upon other individuals to gain a notion of how to live my life in the best way possible. I want to live my life in the best way possible because I am committed from being a human to enjoy, like I cannot help but enjoy certain experiences, and I cannot help to suffer in other experiences. In so much, each of one of those experiences that I go towards, I need to know how to reach them. I need to know which experiences are enjoyable, and I need to know essentially what it means to live a good life in a form of a narrative. So I don't care about one experience, I care about all of my experiences with varying weights. All of this requires an investigation into myself. And I can only do that investigation with another person. Let me explain why. So essentially, individuals are incapable of any form of verification or falsification without another individual. I require someone else to allow me to create a language game from which I can divest the world. So if I wanted to say that this is a table in front of me, what I'm actually doing is I am signifying towards an object. I'm pointing towards an object and I've created a signifier, a concept, something that represents that object. That object is then agreed upon and is formed, and then we can form a language game off that way. We can hold that constant. If I didn't hold that constant, I wouldn't be able to say that this is a table and this is a chair. I would instead make unjustified assertions, and I can confuse myself, and my reasoning would always be inductive, in other words. So deductive reasoning is conceptually confined to a mutual cooperation. And so what I'm saying is that the grounding of ethics is this mutual cooperation. I have to see you as equal to myself. This is what Hegel calls a master-slave relationship, master-slave morality, and essentially this equality that exists between us. If it is unequal, would create a bias assertions of what I think is good and bad. So when I try and investigate myself, if I don't take your considerations into account with equal weight to my own, I would be unjustified in my assertions, I would lack epistemic grounding, and so I would be open to the principle of explosion. Now, why would we want to avoid that? We'd want to avoid, essentially falling into epistemic nihilism, because it creates an inability to understand how we should live our lives, in the sense that everything becomes absurd. So I wouldn't know what was going to hurt me or help me. I wouldn't know what it means to experience good and bad in any respect, and whether I'm seeking pleasure or pain, and in various degrees. And I also wouldn't have a solid sense of identity. I wouldn't understand who I am, which means I would go into existential crisis, and that creates anxiety and angst. And essentially what we see nowadays throughout all of our society, actually, most of our generations do experience existential crisis and are in anxiety and angst. And I think that if we have a strong ethical foundation to avoid nihilism, then we will overcome these problems. Now, this means that what we have to consider is everyone. We have to consider a non-biased, objective view of what is considered good and bad, which is in reflection to desire, as I said, and that these desires is the desire of everyone, desire simpliciter. What we find is that desire simpliciter doesn't just include anthropocentric morality. It also includes a sentientist view of morality. In other words, animals have desire, and so if we are being truly unbiased, we will take into consideration animal suffering as alike to our own. So I hope that explains my position. Thank you.
Thanks so much, gentlemen. With that, we will jump right into the conversation. Appreciate you guys.
Oh, I don't get.
Oh wait.
Yeah.
You're right. Go ahead.
I was like, okay.
Go ahead, Shirley.
So that was quite an interesting introduction. It's going to be quite interesting to interact with you, just because our philosophies, our ethical philosophies, are actually quite similar. Maybe it's just because of our philosophical influences and the different ideas. I even heard you bring in some Peirce, the signifier significant distinction, and the things like that, which is quite interesting. Just because I'm studying a lot of Peirce recently. There were a lot of different claims there. I really didn't, other than the end part of your argument, I didn't see the connection to animals up until that point, until you made the assertion that desire simpliciter is what's intrinsically valuable. That's probably where we're going to get hung up, I imagine. Okay. Under my view, obviously, I agree with the telos. I think that all animals, all humans, everything that exists really has a telos, even if it has no subjectivity. So I would agree with that. As an Aristotelian, I think that everything tries to go towards its end. And so there are ways that things can go badly or poorly for them based on that end. But I think everything has that, not just animals or people. In terms, I was a little confused about a couple things that you said. You said that deductive reasoning relies on the outside person, on some kind of person to falsify or verify things. I mean, it seems like a priori claims are just a priori. It doesn't, at least a priori analytic claims, they don't really need, like, you can make a syllogism out of purely a priori analytic claims. But you do derive experience out of the world to what definitions are. So I can see somewhat of a perspective there of what you're arguing. My argument essentially is going to be a couple different things. So the first thing I'm going to say is that not all animals are worthy of equivalent, or some case any, moral protection. I think that there is a distinction between many different animals. I don't think that some animals even have subjectivity, which you can say that, well, they're not considered animals under your view, and we can talk about that. But that's where I'd like to go on that basis. Basically, the distinction I make between animals and humans is the capacity for moral reasoning. I think that it's in our essence, it's in our biological essence, that what it means to be human is to be capable of moral reasoning. And when I say human, I'm not talking about some kind of biological definition of human. I'm talking about like the metaphysical. So you might in modern parlance might be equivalent to person in some kinds of philosophical discourse, because if an alien had the capability of moral reasoning, then they would be qualified as a moral agent as well. That being said, I don't necessarily think that you need to be capable of moral reasoning to have moral consideration. I think that there are certain moral considerations that animals are afforded based on them being the subject of a life. I don't know if you're familiar with the animal rights philosopher Tom Regan, but he makes this distinction where there are certain animals which are subjects of a life, which means they have certain characteristics that make them worthy of moral consideration. And so that would be something like beliefs, desires, perception, memory, psychophysical continuance, or a sense of future, these kind of characteristics. And I would say that the literature, at least on invertebrates, is pretty clear that at least the most of them, besides cephalopods, do not have. Besides cephalopods, don't have any of those characteristics. And there's an argument about whether fish do. I mean, American philosopher Gary Verner did a research study on this, and he did a meta-analysis on all the relevant data on invertebrates and vertebrates, and he concluded that no invertebrates besides cephalopods have these type of characteristics. And so I would consider them completely without moral consideration on a similar level to other things without beliefs and desires, such as, inanimate objects. So that would include, and people say, well, what's the relevance of that? Not many vegans are out campaigning for bivalves, for example, right? It's not like vegans are saying don't eat bivalves. They're not seriously doing that a lot. But there are certain animals within the invertebrate kingdom that they do advocate for. Now, I can just name a few, and so it's not just completely irrelevant. I mean, Vegan Gains, for example, he puts he puts moral consideration upon ants and other arthropods.
Because they can pass the mirror test.
Yeah, and so I'm thinking so I don't think that they're morally relevant. I don't think that any invertebrates besides cephalopods are. And I would say that, again, and I would also argue that fish probably aren't morally relevant as well. But yeah, so that's basically where I'd like to start off, and then we can move from there.
Yeah. Should I just ask you questions now?
Sure. Well, I think that, it'd be good if we go off of questions. I would say that I mostly think that, I haven't mentioned this in any of the debates, but I am actually, in practice, a lacto-vegetarian. But but I'm arguing that there's not a moral obligation for veganism. That's my argument. Actually, I don't really eat any meat, but I'm just saying that that's my argument.
Okay.
Awesome. So go ahead. Feel free to ask me anything.
Yeah, okay. So first, I'd like to say, when you say, a priori reasoning can be done without another individual, I guess my point is that language itself I would consider reason. And I think language is a cooperative endeavor. So, even to have the concepts necessary to reason a priori, to say that P is P, to hold P and P constant throughout the syllogistic form or whatever you put an argument in, you will genuinely require another individual to hold a language game constant. So I don't think a priori reasoning can even be done
so the conception, so the language is prior to the conception?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it's not. It's not I would say language is prior to the conception. I think Hegel calls it sometimes calls things preconcepts. I would say that preconceptualization occurs within, for example, in non-linguistic beings. I think that they, still are able to divest the world. They're just not able to hold that constant in a form of reasoning, a form in where they could gain knowledge epistemically. For example, they may come to conclusions the same as us and have problem-solving capabilities, but I think without communication, there's no way for them to to be able to hold their interpretation of concepts constant. There'd be nothing objective for them to refer to see if they are actually using their concepts correctly. So like even analytic arguments then kind of fall apart because you don't know whether the object is equal to itself. But I think you also brought up Aristotle. And I think you said that Aristotle said gave consideration to everything's moving towards an end, whether it's plants, animals, the universe is moving towards the prime mover. In other words, like there is a constant movement within the universe. I think that the only reason that kind of is able to occur in the first place is because we would say it is because of the conceptualization within thinking, and that what we actually live in is, I would argue, for idealism. So
are you gonna go Bishop Berkeley on me now? We're gonna have
no. I'll be Hegelian. I'd still be Hegelian.
Idealism. Okay.
Yeah, so like objective idealism. So it's not as if what I'd be really saying is that we see this movement in the first place as conceptual movement. I mean, like for example, the good knife is the one that cuts, in the words of Aristotle. If we look at that kind of understanding of reality, the final cause, I think that the final cause is always in relation to the subject, and subjectivity in the first place. The reason it has cause, and we give this conceptualization in the first place attributed to objects, is because of the thinking itself. I don't think there's anything prior to the ethical relationship between individuals, which is hence essentially the basis of any kind of like existentialism.
Well, I'd push back on that, though. I mean, I'd push back on that because I would say that final cause existed within the nature of things, right? It's what makes them. I mean, so like we could get into like philosophy of nature here, right? So the final cause is exhibited within its behavior in the world, right? Things seem to have behaviors in the world that so they act in certain ways, right? Like they have some kind of essence, right? And so that's their final cause being exhibited outside of, I mean, obviously, if you want to argue for idealism,
existence precedes.
Yeah, exactly.
Existence precedes essence. Yeah. That's what I'll be arguing.
Well, and you could even argue that, right? Like, I mean, you could argue that, but my point is, like, because we could argue about whether the mind really like just puts these things on the world, right? Like if we're just having like a Kantian view, like this transcendental idealistic kind of projection.
Well, essentially what I'd be saying is that all of our institutions are reflections of an ethical relationship, which then allows us to divest the world. It's not that as if the world isn't like that, as if these plants and trees and whatever aren't moving towards something, but that itself is the conclusions that we form from having an ethical relationship with the other in the first place.
Right, but how would you know that outside of a human context? Like if there were like, so example, this is the classic like Kantian like thing. Well, like before, when there were no subjects around, did the scientific laws still hold, something like that?
Well, I think that kind of misses the point. It's not as if the scientific laws could not exist, because a law is a transcendental object in the first place. Like what a scientific law is.
Well, that's the argument versus realism versus idealism. It's just kind of presupposed there.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, like obviously I'm not like we can have the metaphysical debate on whether it's right or not. But I mean, even the conceptual existence of a law, I think would be impossible like without a conscious mind. It's not to say that the physical reality which the law is attributed to didn't exist. It's just that the concept and its inferential basis didn't exist. If you see what I'm saying, like the institution and the
I understand
the
what
overall
you're saying, but what Kant would say is like we can't even make conclusions about that, right? Like we can't make conclusions about the behavior of objects.
No, you can't. Yeah. You can't make conclusions because you'd be preceding
yourself.
Existence.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which goes beyond
seems a little
logic.
unintuitive when you think. I mean, like it seems like they would behave the same way. And that would be my argument as a realist, right?
But that's fair enough. You can say that. I mean, for example, you could say that the conclusions of the institutions from which you exist point towards that. This is an objective physical world that operates with certain criteria which have been going on for millennia, which is actually, to be entirely honest with you, probably what I would say. I'm not going to say that the Earth popped up when I did, like absolutely no, like, but that's to say that like, and it's not to say that we need some sort of consciousness that's constantly observing the world and some sort of God to give it reality in a kind of Berkeleyan sense, because I wouldn't say that either. I think the point of what the point is that it's not to say that the laws, like the existence of reality, probably, like I would say rationally, you could conclude that it pre-existed to us.
Right.
But knowledge of that reality could not have pre-existed anything. So to say that you could have knowledge of something that pre-existed the foundations of knowledge is the epistemic issue. It's not to say that it's an epistemic issue, maybe not a physical, like an actual issue in terms of like you don't need to make any assertions in the first place. It'd just be saying, right, chances are, the physical world did exist. Is there a way to verify or falsify that? Absolutely not. Let's move on.
Well, that's not exactly the argument, though, right?
Hold on. Forgive me for cutting in. Just to be sure, for those who have just arrived, as I think, especially if they happen to be newer to philosophy, because you guys are both well versed and well read and have deep roots within philosophy, if you want to kind of like tie back kind of these ideas just in a basic, like, short way, but tie back these ideas to like how these kind of the downstream effects for whether or not veganism is an obligation or not.
So the point of that I'm trying to make right here, perspective philosophy. Do you have can I call you by your first name or something? Sorry, perspective.
Yeah, just Lewis.
Lewis, thank
is
you.
Fine.
Lewis. So the point that Lewis is trying to make is that we don't need to make epistemic claims about what happened before subjectivity. And why that's relevant is because what I'm going to argue, or what I'm arguing, essentially, is that essence is this kind of fundamental thing about the world. And the reason why that's relevant to veganism is because I don't think that this final cause that he's going to appeal to kind of justify our care about animals is going to work, because I think it applies to everything. Everything has final cause. And then there's a deeper level that we're going to go into. It might not be super relevant. Maybe we should just move on to subjectivity and go to animals, talk about like them specifically, just because I don't want to get people lost in the weeds. And
just to quickly, maybe give it another quick summary. The reason that I think this final cause thing is interesting is because, like, what I'm trying to say is that, like, essentially knowledge claims in general relate to desire and the individual being a subject in the first place, and the grounding that I'm arguing for ethics is to say that epistemic claims are founded upon an ethical relationship. So if he can show that they're not, and that we do not require, let's say, another individual to understand the world in such a way that we can gain moral knowledge, and that we can do that privately, then he would be able to ultimately undermine my ethical stance to the point in which my epistemic claims and my ethical claims would fall apart, which would then go downstream to my claims about animals and the considerations of sentient beings. So like that's kind of like the real foundation. I mean, we're arguing metaphysics pretty much, yeah. So like you can't really. But
I wonder though. I don't know if I would. See, this is the problem. I don't think I would disagree, like in principle, that ethical systems require require more than one person, like a community essentially. I would agree with that. The only reason why I was disputing on that is because of a deeper metaphysical point that I think is true. But I'm not sure that's going to be relevant, because I do agree that ethical systems require communities. That's the basis of ethics.
Oh, well, that's brilliant.
So just to be clear, I'm not making that argument.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's fine. And then obviously, if we're moving on to animals and sentience, I think that whether invertebrates are sentient, I mean, that's a kind of I think that the literature I've read, and most literature on consciousness in general that I've read actually, is really terrible. Primarily because neuroscientists have no idea what they're talking about. Philosophers are not involved enough, and you can't test this.
Agreed.
We can make claims, and I think that, like, and are justified, that like a certain neurological complexity is necessary. I think for if we take like a physicalist kind of notion, it doesn't have to be a physicalist, but at least material notion of consciousness originating from the biological form, which I think is justified. I think I would say that without brains and central nervous systems, we would not be conscious,
right?
And have conscious preferences, which is the foundations of ethics and desire. I guess the issue is that, do I know whether what the limits of like the bare minimum complexity necessary for consciousness is? Not a clue. I don't think we do know that yet. Like, for example, there's this whole thing, like, it's like intuitively I'd say plants are probably not conscious. They seem to lack all of the necessary criteria I would see for.
That's like a psychophysicalist, right? No.
Yeah, but there's or like a panpsychist or something. Yeah, like
yeah, exactly.
Atoms are conscious. but I don't see any real conscious preferences. I think the likelihood of conscious preferences in plants, but like, obviously it doesn't matter if they were conscious, because more cows and chickens and so on are killing plants by eating them, and so you actually end up like, it's the whole trophic
Fair enough.
pyramid.
No,
isn't
of course,
it?
yeah, I understand.
Yeah. So there's always going to be less plant death. So just in case that anyone in the comment section is like, what about the plants? You save more plants if you're vegan anyway, so don't worry. But like, yeah, I'd say plants are probably not conscious, but I like to operate on a principle of moral hazard as well. I think that if there's any kind of doubt involved in, like, not any kind of doubt, but any reasonable doubt as to something being conscious and having preferences, you should treat it as being morally considerable. I think that it's primarily because I think if you, like, for example, the invertebrates, I think if you can say that, and I'm not maybe as well versed on the literature as you, don't get me wrong, but if you could say that the invertebrates could be conscious within reasonable doubt, and that the literature is inadequate to show that they're not conscious, because I think that's where you've got to kind of prove the inverse. And that's where the moral burden lies. I think you've got to prove that they're not conscious within reasonable doubt.
Can you justify that real quick? Just because I don't really see the intuitive, like, it seems like you have to have a reason to have a moral obligation to do something, rather than a reason not to do something or something like that.
Well, I'd say that we'll have a moral obligation to all conscious beings, and if we've agreed with that, then
but we don't know
the bottom line. No, yeah, but if there's an ambiguity, then moral hazard lies upon taking an action which could cause harm, and since harm would be caused on one side and not the other, then we have an obligation to respect the possibility of harm. So it's like let's say there was a 50-50 chance that someone could or could not get hurt at any given time of an action that we take. Let's say it's I don't know, I'm trying to think of quite a risky action. Let's say driving like above the speed limit or something, right? Going really fast. You'd have to show that, like, for example, that if you were to like go to a court, you were to say, like, okay, right, the roads were closed, no one was going to get hurt. You've given justified evidence to say that there was no moral hazard, and that your risk was justified in reference to being a rational course of action. That's what I'm saying essentially with how we consider possible conscious beings.
The quibble I would have there is that it just seems like that there is always moral hazard, right? Like, there's always a non-zero moral hazard.
And I think that, like, I'm not saying that we're perfectly rational beings, that we won't make mistakes, and that that this is even applicable in all cases. But the point is to say that this is kind of like, if we would have perfect reason, if we were to be able to understand the world in a perfectly epistemic, with epistemic certainty, then we would be able to give those justifications, and then that would allow us to take these risks. And that's the point I'm saying.
Right, and okay, so I guess I would just make the empirical claim that there's not sufficient evidence. I think it's definitely less than 50%, I would say, at least within the literature right now. Like, I'm just talking about with what's out there right now, that most invertebrates are conscious. Like, that's just my argument. My argument is that it seems like that there's a very little risk, and I understand you're operating with the principle of moral hazard, and I agree with it to some extent. Like, if an action is overly risky, it seems to, because I would argue that the standard by which we judge actions is based on what a rational agent would do, right? Because we are rational agents based on our nature, right? So if it's a rationally justified risk, like, because the risk is so small, I think in this case it is, at least with most invertebrates, especially, I would make the claim, especially for arthropods. I think that there's such a little chance that they're conscious, that even, like, remember, my stance isn't necessarily that consciousness is the be-all, end-all.
It's valuable.
Well, it's not the be-all, end-all, but I'm just saying that I would say that even then, it doesn't seem justified, at least on my opinion.
I understand.
With the review to the literature, that is.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out the opposite kind of view, that, like, even if, like, there is an ambiguity there, that, like, obviously, I'd say, like, everyone do their own research for one.
Yeah.
It's important to recognize, and obviously, try and be careful, and I guess obviously moving on to fish, I think fish are far more complex than insects, and I think that we've shown that certain fish. Fish is a very broad term. For one, there are so many varieties of fish ranging through so many different forms of animals. It's hard to say that whether fish themselves. Fish is, like, I don't think we can just say, like, fish aren't conscious. I think you'd have to give it on an individual species by species basis, really. I think we'd probably agree on that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
The same thing with birds, I would say, actually.
Yeah, I think that that'd be fair enough. And then, but then obviously, I think, to be entirely honest with you, I think anything with a operating central nervous system, to me, from what I've read, seems to have enough neurological complexity to be conscious. At least I'd say I have a meta process which could analyze its phenomenological experiences in a conscious framework. I'd say it probably does, even in a minimal sense.
I'd be willing
Obviously,
to grant
whether it's
that.
conscious. Yeah, we'll also have to talk about what conscious complexity obviously entails, and this is the issue with the literature. What is the bare minimum, like, what is the minimum processing power needed to run a conscious simulation of one's experiences? And that obviously depends upon the complexity of the experiences themselves in anyways. So, like, human experience might be much more complex than, let's say, the experience of any given fish, but that doesn't mean that their experience is not valuable to them and that they aren't having a subjective experience in reference to the much less complex simulation that they're running. So there's also that to be considered. And I think that just because it's more complex doesn't make it more valuable. They could feel an equal qualitative weight in terms of how they actually experience suffering and pleasure. Like, for example, a fish might live in a less complex simulation of reality, and in that it'll have its own drives and its own way to seek its end goal, and it has pain and pleasure mechanisms tied in to those goals. How it experiences those qualitative experience is, one, absolutely impossible to measure because it's the hard problem of consciousness, and two, is likely to have the same impact upon that being of its own will, in terms of its frustration and so on, as it would a more complex being. Like, just because a hawk can see with greater intensity doesn't mean that it values its sight, doesn't mean that its sight gives it more pleasure, or like that it would appreciate a sunset to a greater degree or anything like that. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
The whole point is the qualitative experience isn't necessarily the same as the quantitative experience of actually perceiving the world, and that we can't conflate those two, which kind of defeats the idea of a sentience hierarchy, I think, which is, I think, a problem that a lot of vegans bring up.
Well, I would argue that interest isn't like, okay, so there are a lot of different points here, and I'm going to try to join them together. One, so like there's obviously the problem that we can't measure consciousness, right? We can't measure what a conscious experience is. It's kind of like Nagel's whole thing, what's it like to be a bat? Like, we really don't know, because their conscious experience is so much different than ours. Even if we even if their conscious experience was similar to ours, we wouldn't know it just because we're not bats, right? We don't have a similar type of phenomenological experience as them.
But I think, doesn't he also conclude that there's the likelihood that they could exist in a ready-to-hand state in a Hegelian sense, because they'll be incapable of conceptualization, which will allow them to have
well, they definitely wouldn't have present at hand experiences under Hegel, which is under Heidegger.
An idea of, like, for example, how they could react in relation to certain phenomenological stimuli.
Well, wait a minute. Let me back up, because I wanted to address your points.
Sorry.
Heidegger definitely would say animals are not Dasein. If you've read anything about his phenomenological experience, he would say they're not Dasein, and Dasein are kind of the morally relevant things, even though he doesn't really think there is morals. But we'll just kind of skip over Heidegger's intricacies. And because I just want to make sure I hit all your points, and we're having a proper discussion, right? So what you had said was that maybe, okay, so like, let's say that the sentience, we can't really measure it. We'll say that it's equal, right? Like the amount of sentience that's needed for pleasure and pain is the same. Like their experience of pain is similar to ours, exactly the same. Which I would say, I don't know if we have a way of knowing. But I don't think we have a way of knowing that with other humans either, right? Except for their articulation, like they say that they feel this way. And though I would argue, like, again, in Nagel's perspective, that we understand what it's like to be a human, so we have a greater understanding than we do for, like, a bat. But let's just pretend like they're equal, just for argument's sake, right? There are other relevant things that we need to justify, right? I don't know whether pain and pleasure are significant in the absence of, like, psychophysical continuance, for example. Like the idea that something has an identity within itself, like knows that it's one identity, because then the pleasure and pain isn't really applied to anything, any person, as it were, or any individual. And this is kind of like, and I don't know how familiar you are with Tom Regan. Have you read anything of his?
Yeah, I've read some Regan, and the argument you're making is also an argument given by in the book Against Liberation, written by Leahy,
Right.
who's a Wittgensteinian.
So like there are different, I think that as you get some of these characteristics, your moral consideration goes up. Like if you're an individual, right, if you have a psychophysical continuance, the way things can go bad or well for you is very relevant, because you are one individual throughout a course of a life, right? Or if you don't have any memory, for example. I mean, obviously memory is a morally relevant thing, because you can be harmed in the past and you know that you were harmed because you remember that, right? So these things are relevant, at least. Can we argue?
Well, I think they're morally relevant in the sense that they hold consideration to how we treat other individuals, but they're not what make the individual actually be capable of be treated with respect. I don't respect you because you have a memory which allows me to understand you as an individual throughout time. I respect you because of your experiences in reflection to what you actually feel and how you can experience pains and pleasures. I don't reflect like notions of I don't respect notions of like identity. For example, I'm not going to respect, let's say, an individual more or less because they have a better articulated identity and a better notion of self and a stronger sense of self-continuation. Like, let's say someone lost their memory and formed an entirely new identity in relation to the environment that they now rediscover themselves in. That person had both individuals who have formed, as in the first person and then the second person who's then developed after they've lost their memory, have equal moral consideration.
Okay,
in
wait
reflection
a
to
second. Make
their
a distinction there. We need to make a distinction between accidental and essential properties. Right, because you could accidentally have lost your memory, but to have never had anything like a memory in the first place is a little bit different, right? It's like we're talking about beings that don't have the capacity for memory here.
No, I mean, I was talking about identity there.
Well, identity, I'm sorry. The capacity to understand even identity, as it were.
Well, yeah, but let's say, like, it depends what we mean by identity for the first part. Like, identity is, if we can either take identity, and this is the problem with Leahy, and the problem, to be entirely honest with you, what I would find with most people who argue this, is that they conflate identity with subjectivity. That's not the same thing. Like, what you're doing is you're conflating essence, a notion of, conceptualized notion of who we are and what we are and how we understand ourselves, which would be identity and understanding of what we are in reflection to nature and divesting ourselves from this metaphysical reality in this plane, so objectifying ourselves, in other words, and then we have the experience of being ourselves. Experience, I would argue, predates essence. I do not have an identity and therefore experience. I gain an identity because I'm already experiencing. And
okay,
that's
so there's no
faculties.
such thing under your view as psychological identity.
No, psychological identity is.
There's only the physical identity of the unit, right?
I'd say that the physical consciousness, as in like the physical experiencer, exists, but in so much that they are experiencing, it's a nothingness anyway. It's something that can't be properly articulated and understood. And I'd say that the essence from which we attribute it to it, the notions of identity and conceptualizations, when we objectify ourselves and we start calling ourselves names and and referring to ourselves as I's and talking about how we are psychologically continuous beings, those themselves are constructions applied to consciousness. They aren't the consciousness itself. It's not the identity doesn't give us consciousness. It just lets us talk about it in an intelligible way.
Right. Yeah, this is the distinction between the present at hand and ready to hand that we're gonna get into.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, like, because it's interesting because in principle, I agree to a large extent, but like arguing from the analytical perspective, right? Like we would just argue that these identities are just as real, right? Like, so if even like in a physical sense, I mean, like if we're talking about a physicalist rather than like well, okay, so you're arguing that what's intrinsically valuable, essentially in an analytical frame of mind, or like is qualia, is the ability to have an experience.
Yeah, it's the qualia.
It's the qualia is what you're arguing, not the psychological, physical continuance, not any of that, because that's not what the conscious experience is. Very, very continental of you.
Yeah.
I mean, I love continental philosophy too, so it's like I understand. No, it's quite tempting. I guess then, if we're gonna say that's what you value, I mean, I could go into reasons why I value beliefs, desires, perception, memory, but ultimately, if your argument's going to be that qualia is what's relevant, right? That's ultimately what it's going to come down to.
Well, it's self-evident, isn't it? It's self-evidently positive or negative, and it's the only thing that can be taken as positive or negative in relation to having having a metaphysical foundation. It's that the fittingness of the concept in a Heideggerian sense would only apply to qualia, because qualia is the only thing that is qualitative. It is the qualitative experience. Without being that, the concept no longer fits, and we end up, asserting notions of positive and negative which aren't attributable to reality, which I would say then breaks Hume's law.
Right. So then we're having like this. So we're going to have this discussion. Like, this is going to be an empirical thing then. What exactly has qualia, and like how do we know what has qualia?
Well, this is the thing. I don't think we can fundamentally know what has qualia because of the hard problem of consciousness, which we've just agreed.
Right.
But we can say that maybe there is a minimum complexity necessary for like the simulation of a conscious being, which is, I think, understandable. I think that we should appreciate that there is a moral hazard in relation to these beings, and so if there is any doubt, avoid taking such a risk, because qualia is valuable, and if we do not want to take unjustifiable risks with other potential beings.
Right. And so, okay, so I think that's just kind of like, so what exactly is desire on your view?
I would say desire is the action urging process within a being.
Mm-hmm.
It essentially connects the qualitative experience with our actions in the first place, and essentially our movement towards our telos, which is fundamental.
Well, okay, wait a minute. So then I don't want to dive too far into, I don't know, because then we're going to have to get in, again, I would disagree, right? I don't think that I think that's just an inherent part of the universe, telos is. Even like non-conscious agents have telos.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, like we can even as long as we just agree that we have one anyway, and that we're like and we'll agree on, like, are you like McIntyre as well? The functional concept of man.
Yes, quite.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but I guess this is kind of the distinction here. I mean, I don't think that that many animals, especially invertebrates, have desires. Or
if I may as well, can I just to qualify to the crowd that are watching this, the functional concept of man in McIntyre? Would you like to talk about it, like give a brief explanation of it, or shall I?
Just
so that they know what the hell we're talking about.
I mean, if you think it's relevant here, yeah.
Kind of,
go ahead.
because I think that what I would say essentially that the functional concept of man is essentially the foundation of human action, that we are already trying to achieve a goal, and in that we necessarily require ethics to achieve that goal.
It's an Aristotelian view. It's essentially that we have an essence, that we have this functional purpose, if you want to use like analytic talk, that is built into our very nature, and that we're already trying to do. It's kind of like in Heidegger, where like we have this essential nature that we're always trying to do something, always trying to get at something, which is the functional concept of man, which is the rational, essentially Aristotle's rational animal, like always trying to get at rationality, as it were.
See, but then the continental critique of this is that the knowledge of such an essence is not inherent to our being. We do not have it, and that what we do when we apply essence is we are applying transcendental objects to a state of being which we cannot have fundamental knowledge, and so it's always inadequate. And so what we are doing is fundamentally always trying to investigate it further and further, which is why there's an issue with that. But I think
an Aristotelian would disagree, though, right? I mean, like, he would say that those things are just in the nature, and it's not like we're not trying to apply transcendental ideas from inside our head into things. Rather, those things are just within the nature of things. Like, you have to make this anti-realist assumption that those things really don't have those properties. Right.
Well, no. Actually, I completely disagree. Like, for example, and this is why I said, like, I think Hegel actually really relates well to Aristotle, because I think that it's not to say that the object itself doesn't have a nature from which we are trying to understand. I think in all Hegelian ethics, and I think if you read Brandam's inferentialism, an inference applies the possibility of it actually obtaining truth and reality. So to say that humans are what humans are implies that there is a human to be understood, and I would actually argue that there is, and that we are justified in believing that. It's just to say that our concepts aren't perfect. We construct the concepts, we do not abstract them. And in so much that when we are investigating reality, what we tend to find is that these concepts are not perfect fits. And so what we do is we reevaluate them hermeneutically and reapply them and create new concepts which fit better, and we constantly improve upon our ethics and our epistemological systems.
Right, and again, a pure Aristotelian Thomist would not agree with that, right? He would say,
no, they would.
Okay, so at least we understand.
That's because there would be a certain essence before for
exactly.
existence. But I'd say that
It precedes the experience, right?
The ethical mechanism is the same though. Like in
Understood.
terms of the Aristotelian would say that the institution shows why it's flawed against human life, and then overall McIntyre even makes the same point in many ways. One, he says that human nature doesn't exist fundamentally without culture.
Right.
He says humans do not exist fundamentally without culture, which Hegel would absolutely agree.
Right. Aristotle would agree too, right? He talks about it in the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says that man is necessarily a social animal. So ethics arises out of being social, right? If there's nothing to be social about, there is no ethics. I agree.
Yeah, and I think that the point, and McIntyre even says that the goal is modified by the journey, and he gives this reference to quests, like the quest in the Middle Ages. The knight starts upon his quest, and then halfway through he realizes that the goal that he's seeking is the wrong goal, and he changes the end of the quest. So the quest evolves, and the narrative changes, and the end goal changes as the quest goes on. That's essentially, I think, built into the Hegelian and continental notion, but not so much a notion which describes an essence which is to be abstracted.
Right.
I think there is a fittingness of the concept which we can test against reality, and I think that applies nicely within existentialism. I don't think that would necessarily fit for, let's say, something which are attributed, like a Platonic notion, which attributed, form and essence before existence.
Right, and that's just the disagreement there. Right. Like
Yeah,
I think that's just the disagreement, right? We're talking about metaphysics, whether the actual essence precedes the existence. But I just don't want to dive too far out the rabbit hole. Only because, on one hand, I'm going to end it, at least because, so I'm arguing for the position that veganism isn't a moral obligation today, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of metaphysics. But the fact is, because I would fundamentally, being a phenomenologist, like I think that existence does precede essence, right? But that's not going to be relevant. I don't think it's relevant to the critique right now, or the argument we're trying to make. So I just think that we should leave it off for now.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that's
I just don't
fine.
think it's particularly relevant.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if we can agree that, like, what is then what we'll have to consider is what is considerable morally, right? Like, ethically considerable.
And that's what we're arguing.
And we don't want to, break Hume's law or anything along those lines. And I think McIntyre does a great job in showing us how not to. The functional concept of man. And so, what we end up in is an inferential relationship with the other, where we try and create inferences to what actually is good in reference to our fundamental nature. And if our fundamental nature is to respect an aspect of ourselves, and which is found in the other as well, and what they are trying to respect within themselves, what I'm trying to respect within me is what I think is inherent within our being. I would argue is inherent within our being is this notion of the qualia. Now, if we are saying that we're respecting qualia itself and qualitative experience, then why would we not attribute that to other sentient beings?
Well, I don't think that that's the only thing that we value in other people, right? I think that
what else could be valuable?
Huh?
What else could be ethically relevant?
Well,
valuable?
I think that there's the easiest one, right? Is the capacity for moral reasoning. That is something that changes our moral behavior with regards to the agent. For example, we respect their preferences in different ways. We give them different moral duties and obligations based on that. So I think it incontrovertibly changes their moral nature. Like, if something has the ability to reason morally, then it has a different type of moral nature to something that doesn't have I guess I shouldn't say moral nature, because that would be a little question begging. Yeah, but like our behavior, we'll say, like our present at hand behavior with them.
But that just changes how we respect them.
Ready to hand.
It doesn't change. It doesn't give us a reason to respect them.
Yes, it does. I mean, well,
right?
so behavior informs. Behavior informs theory, right? Like, why do we treat conscious beings that have moral natures, like that act that way differently, than we do? Because that's going to be your whole argument, like the for subjectivity.
Honestly, like behavior fundamentally points towards the experience. We respect the experience. We don't respect the behavior. I don't respect someone's pure, like, I don't look at a computer crunching numbers and like, wow, we really need to preserve that. I unplug it and I don't feel bad at all. Even though it's arguably a purely rational mechanism going through.
It's not rational, I would argue.
That's fair enough. I mean, like, as in, like, it's at least, it's it's using a form of reasoning, whether it's pre-programmed or not. I would kind of say, I'd say that maybe not reason, because I would say reasons in language,
Yeah.
but since it's kind of using its own language, I wouldn't say there's any agency, but and rational agency there, but like there's no reason to say that quantitative, like even let's say we could create a computer, an AI, with a purely quantitative experience where it was conscious but only of the numbers
What
that it was
what would that even
that
mean?
was like. Well, I have no
I
idea.
don't think that's
People have used
possible.
this against. I don't think it's possible either, so I'm just using it as a purely hypothetical scenario. I actually made this argument against someone else where I said I'm pretty sure that's not possible. But let's just imagine it was. Let's say there was just a being which experienced purely rational stimuli. It didn't have a pain, a positive or negative response to the stimuli that it was conscious of. It just was aware of it. It was pure awareness of a quantitative experience. Like, I don't know, it's basically the computer version of watching paint dry. Right. But it didn't care about watching the paint dry. It didn't have any preferences at all, no interests, nothing along the sort. Would we feel bad in turning it off? Would there be a moral quandary in turning it off?
I'm just not convinced
No.
I understand what that even means. What it even would mean to have an experience of just quantitative data, right? I don't think that quantitative data has experience or like is experiential in nature. So I'm not even sure. So like if a computer, like even if like you could program a computer to have those characteristics, like I'm almost a perfect AI, right? I don't know what. Again, I would argue like Serlian, right? Like that really wouldn't have any qualitative experience. Actually, it wouldn't actually be an experience.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it okay. Like, I mean, if we were to say that it was purely conscious, but like, and I do doubt whether consciousness can exist without a subjective framework from which it that helps you divest the world. As in, like, but then I don't see any necessarily reason why, like for example, if you were to create something which had receptors able to perceptually differentiate objects within the world, why it would necessarily have to have a qualitative experience of that, why it would necessarily have to be positive or negative in relation to that phenomenological state that it's in. But regardless, even just in a hypothetical sense, let's just assume for the state of for this that it is possible.
Right. But if you grant that like there's a here, I'll let you go. Sorry, I apologize.
The reason I'm just saying it is just that I don't think that we would say that it's not the moral thinking we respect, because if the moral thinking is what we respected, then why did we start thinking morally in the first place?
No, but
do you know what I mean?
But again, remember what I said. I didn't say that that's all that we respect. I said that that's something else. That's something that changes our evaluation. So I'm saying
changes how we respect them.
I want to make this clear. Like there is some moral relevance to just being subjective, some amount, right? I think that having a subjective experience is morally relevant. But I'm saying that there is other things which are also morally relevant that changes our evaluations of our actions toward the being. If something doesn't, and I think that makes certain actions permissible and impermissible within that context.
No, I agree. I would agree. It changes how we would respect them, but it doesn't tell us why we respect them. I like, for example, right? Let's just assume, like, let's take ready to hand in present at hand states. Let's say a child is incapable of having as a complex psychological experience of a present at hand state as an adult, which I think is a justifiable claim to make. Right. I think that children just lack the necessary conceptual complexity. So let's just say that they're having they're going along their day-to-day lives and they're feeling ready, in a mostly ready to hand state. The fall over and they start crying, they've hurt their knee. I would say that what we can say is that they're probably incapable of distancing themselves away from the pain in a present at hand state as in a stoic-like environment, right, because they've fallen over, right? And because they're incapable of that conceptual complexity. And so they may feel that pain more intensely than an adult who could grit their teeth and bear it and allow themselves to, think of something else, distract themselves, or even understand that this pain will end. And it also removes that idea of like uncertainty and angst, and they know that it's not serious and so on. So you can say that there is a different consideration even in relation, like it changes the experience itself. I completely agree. but it doesn't tell me why the experience is valuable. The only thing, the value of the experience has to be inherent within the experience for the concept to be applicable in the first place. Morality and ethics is an investigation into that experience. It's not what it doesn't give the value. The value is not attributed because of the investigation. Otherwise, the investigation would have been fruitless in the first place.
Well, okay, so again, there's a distinction there, right? What I'm saying is that, okay, so what makes, let me see if I could drill you down a little bit. What makes the distinction, why do we treat different conscious agents differently based on these type of properties?
Why do we treat them differently?
Right.
I would say that it modifies their experience, and the qualitative experience is modified by it. As in, they would have an experience of qualia, and that is modified by the phenomena from which they are aware of.
And so do we have an obligation to change that, any behavior that would seem to make the qualitative experience better, do we have an obligation to do that? Or at least, or let me rephrase that, or at least make their experience less bad?
Yeah, right. Okay, that makes it even. Yeah, I would say yes.
Okay, so and what about them, or what about that situation makes you have the moral obligation, as opposed to seeing to like non-action, right? Like not doing anything.
What about them? I'd say that fundamentally that they hold the same characteristic of you as you, which you hold valuable. That you hold a categorical notion of value in relation to what they're experiencing. You value qualia, you value experience, because that's what you value in yourself, because that's all that is valuable in yourself.
Okay, but let me rephrase that, like, so that maybe you understand a little better.
Okay, yeah.
So it seems to me it would make a cow's life a lot better if I gave it, cushy conditions. We fed it like the best hay. We reduced its suffering to the utmost extent, right? But what's going to be the distinction there between what we have to do for the cow and what we should do for the cow?
I'd say the distinction that what we have to do...
Sorry, I made it, but I think you understood. The distinction between what we should do and what we don't need to do, or like is not morally obligated.
Well, I'd say that the first thing I'd say is that moral obligations are typically in the negative. Ethics in laws, I think that like it's more about me not hindering your subjectivity and you not hindering my subjectivity. But then I think, to be entirely honest with you, I think that as time goes on, while moral obligations become more fleshed out and more detailed, like the ways in which we can allow the greatest expression of subjectivity in relation to having the best experience would overall be our obligation. So what if I can, like, for example, facilitate a cow's ability to eat hay or whatever, and it has a great time, am I morally obliged to do so in all circumstances? I'd say that I'd say that the ethical obligations that we have are institutional, and that they don't exist on a purely subject by subject basis. My individual obligations are not given to me because of my moral reasoning in a given scenario, but are given to me by a normative system which is institutionally bounded.
I guess that we're gonna run into that metaphysical problem again. Like, if you say like that there is like an essence that is not founded within the thing, then obviously we're gonna go right back into that.
It's not that. I just say that the deductive ethical process, like ethical reasoning, is institutional. I think that individuals make ethical assertions individually. That
ethicals is communicative, and I agree. Like, it's socially, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything intrinsic. Like you said, even if we didn't know it, there would still be that intrinsic nature. Like, even if we could never discover it, like we could never reason it out, right? But there would still be something there. There would still be an essence, like that. Even if we couldn't articulate it, and there weren't, like, we'd still be rational agents, assuming that we acted that way.
It's not that I even disagree with as I said, the fittingness of the concept. I don't see that it causes a problem. Like, essentially, it's not that I'm saying that the cow does not have the thing that we respect, because I'm definitely saying that the cow does have the thing that we respect. I'm just saying that there's an epistemic issue in asserting essence before existence. It's not, as I said, but that doesn't mean that the application of ethical concepts is impossible. And I would actually argue the exact opposite, which is why, and I think Hegel would as well. Like, absolutely. It definitely fundamentally, I could say that there is something to be respected within the cow, and and in so much intrinsically, yeah.
Go ahead.
And like, yeah, no, like, I sort of agree there. Like, it's not as if we don't agree, because otherwise, like, if the inference didn't actually relate to reality, then I'd be playing a game for its own sake, and ethics would be unfounded and would be a nihilism.
Right.
So it wouldn't make any sense anyway. Like, the point I'm making is essentially that there is something to be respected in the cow, and the way that we understand what is to be respected is in an institutional basis, and like what my individual personal obligations are exist in an institution which reflects the greatest expression.
Yeah, this is like the Hegelian like being in a world, right? Like, it's reflective of all these connections between subjectivities that have different views and different wants and desires. And because of this web, we have certain obligations because of the web itself, not because of any particular individual in the web.
Yeah. Well, it's the individual finds them. Was it the subject finds themselves in the objective? Yeah. That's the point. So it's not like as if it's unrelated. Like, the universal application of ethics is not unrelated in a Kantian in a Kantian sense, where it's given from some sort of almost a divinity.
Right.
Like, it intrinsically relates to the subjects and to the particular. Like, those individuals themselves are what is valuable, but the system doesn't consider one individual's assertion of value. It considers every individual's assertion of value.
I understand that. Like,
for it to be objective and rational.
Right, and I understand that. What I'm trying to drill down is what makes something, like any statement, a moral obligation, like any particular thing. Like, if I were to say veganism is a moral obligation, right? What exactly makes something a moral obligation versus, like, I think Ayn Rand makes this distinction between like a whim and like a desire, right? So like, where's going to be the distinction there? Where is it like just something that we could do to help them, right? Versus like something that we should do to help them.
Well, I would say that what is being rationally determined within the institutions, and I'd say that the institution itself is in reflecting of a certain concept, and that concept is in qualitative experience. I think that it always moves towards qualitative experience and reflects the values of those qualitative experiences.
I mean, I think that they're obviously other ethical considerations are made that are not qualitative experience.
No, yeah, you can get ethical, but then they typically
like. Would you argue that like somebody in Roman times have an ethical obligation to go vegan because of the inherent,
I would say that,
nature of
if you say that,
ethical discourse?
But what I would say is that their ethical discourse in the first place originated because of subjectivity, and that's what it's related to. I'd say that the overall normative expression of that fundamental link was inadequate because of the master-slave morality that appeared in Rome. Rome was an unequal state with improper reasoning, and therefore came to faulty conclusions. Like, that's why they had slavery. That's why they had all of these other ethical problems. Right. It's not their fault. The language and that conceptualization hadn't yet met this stage of development. So they could not have known. It's not as if they are bad people. They were just ignorant to the truth. Now, it's the same with, like, the Romans didn't understand physics. Right. The Romans didn't understand, high-level mathematics. Does that mean that our society should abandon such things? Absolutely not.
That's not. Well, I mean, but that's not the argument I was making. I think that you understand the thrust there, right?
The thrust would be essentially like what are our obligations in relation to like our ethical spheres, and that the normative expression. I would say that veganism is the conclusions that we will meet from the internal critique of internal and external critique in relation to welfarism and in relation to human rights. I think when you see that, like human rights and the growing of animal rights, they are one and the same. The ethical, it's like, when Jeremy Bentham, in like the 1700s wrote essentially, what is morally considerable in relation to, what's the full quote again?
You're the vegan. You're supposed to know the Bentham quote.
I know. I should know it off by heart. What is it?
I don't know. If you're gonna appeal to rights, I'm just gonna appeal to Bentham too and say rights are nonsense upon stilts, right?
Yeah, but like the only point, one, Bentham is wrong about many things, but utilitarianism
I don't like
utilitarianism
either. It's okay.
But he was right essentially in showing the foundations of our reasoning, like being in relation to desire. The expression of how we respect that desire is normatively embedded within our culture. It's not to say that that is not the foundation. It's just that how we respect it and our understanding of it is institutionally embedded, and it constantly progresses. That's why we move from tribalism to nationalism to anthropocentrism, and that's why we're going to move from
Oh my gosh, are you really going to pull the dialectic on me?
Oh man,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
This is an ongoing historical
Right.
process, which veganism happens to be now.
Right. In your opinion, obviously.
Well, like at least it exists as an institution within our society, so at least it has to be considered in why we're having an ethical debate. So
Right.
it's not whether it's right or wrong is the point of these debates, but in external critique and obviously internal critique between, like, for example, me and Ask Yourself when I'm criticizing the the trade. That's internal critique, and then you have the external critique of us two debating whether we should or should not be vegan. The institution itself, though, is historically embedded. It only makes sense in reference to what's come before
Right.
it. Like, vegan thought could not have existed before 1945 when the Vegan Society was established and said that it was the beginning and end of vegetarianism. Vegetarianism being an institution in our state which was grounded upon a relationship between animals being similar to that of humans, which is historically embedded and has grown from the very bedrock of a tribalistic scenario. Like, that's where ethics came from, a master-slave relationship which is constantly
Well, from a
developing.
social relationship, I would argue. But yeah, I understand what you're
I mean,
saying. I understand what you're
yeah,
saying. I understand the argument. Sorry, we dived into like Hegelian dialectic. I'm trying to track my where we're at. So wait a minute. Let me just make sure I have this clear. On your position, are how do I say this? Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I got this phrase right. So, dietarily vegan actions, right? If they do not interfere with subjectivity, as far as we can tell, or the will of the individual, those are not morally wrong under your view and not obligation to avoid. Like, for example, I'm thinking of, and again, me and Cosmic Skeptic got into this a little bit, but the idea of, like, you had a backyard hen, for example, with laying eggs. And I mean, obviously there are practical concerns, but I'm not talking about the practical concern. There's, like, obviously they need calcium in their diet, so you have to supplement their diet with calcium, and obviously feeding them eggs is a way to do that. But my point is that
I mean, like, you could even like, rather than like thinking of it like that, like rather than making it like, let's say, like a chicken in a backyard hen, which then has its own moral quandary around it, why don't you just make it, if you wanted to show a relationship that like this, you could say that, like, let's say, like human breast milk. Is it wrong to take human breast milk if it was voluntarily given? Well, I don't think a mother who breastfeeds a child is immoral. Like, that child's not exploiting their
But
mother.
then there's the question of voluntary, right? There is no voluntary with animals. You can't really.
Oh yeah. But I think part and parcel of it is whether they will become distressed and harmed from it.
Right.
I think chickens can, like, that's what we are considering in this scenario.
And do you think that's a morally permissible? Yeah. Well, I was gonna morally dangerous situation. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, right, all right, right, okay, like, yeah, I would say that, like, backyard hens as morally dangerous. I think, like, for a few reasons. I think, obviously, you say, like, there's the, like, we talk about the institution which produces the hens. Obviously, in the first instance, it's a 100% vegan argument where, they've got to get the baby hens from somewhere, the males aren't useful, they're going to get killed, and so on. Also, then there's the consideration, are you going to keep the hens after they're spent? Are you going to have these chickens throughout the whole of their lives, even after they're not producing eggs? Or are you going to kill them? And then obviously there's the welfare aspect. How are you keeping these chickens? And then there's also, how do the chickens react when you take their eggs, start producing more eggs, which can be harmful to their health? There's the calcium sort of side of things.
Okay, so here's my problem, right? It seems like that if we take them out of the situation where they're in this kind of chain of being, like, you don't know where they could go if you buy them from these people, right? Like, if you don't buy them, they're likely to go into either slaughterhouses, or maybe in factory farming situations or whatever, right? So, like, the situation is better if you have them and you treat them right. We'll say that it's generally good conditions. It's kind of similar to what I'm arguing about with pets, right? It seems like there are. Let's abstract it from the practicals, because that's what I'm trying to argue, right? There seem like practical situations which subjectivity is mostly respected. There may be individual instances where there's problematic, but obviously we do that with our daily lives. We always need to get better. That's the idea of moral progress. But my question is all interaction with these subjective beings, since we can't know their preferences, at least not by asking them, right? Like, how do we? You can infer, but I mean, like, we don't know whether. Like, and there's also practical conditions. I mean, like, in order to have a pet, you have to lock it up. in order so it doesn't get away.
No, there is the consideration like with the animal's preferences. I think that understanding like I think we both agree that like the biology of the animal is a good indication. For example, like dogs don't like being electrocuted. I think we could make that claim. Like essentially fundamentally harms the ontology of their being to be electrocuted when the biological mechanisms that go on actively react in such a way that we could infer that they are having a pain response, and I don't think that's an unjustifiable claim.
Right, but there are other situations that are not so clear, right?
Like
that's a very clear
exactly,
situation.
Yeah. That's what essentially I was trying to show. I was trying to say that there is ambiguity in certain scenarios, obviously, that we could not know, but whether the ambiguity is enough to defy us interacting with animals as a whole. I'm not seeing any like moral ambiguity to the fact that like if I have a pet dog that gets regularly walked or even has an outside area to go to whenever it wants and so on like that, whether it would feel harm. And also like obviously the relation with the dogs themselves, like like I would like advocate for adopt don't shop for the same reason I would advocate like you don't buy backyard hens in that respect, because then you're producing a breeding system which is then not only it's creating individuals to satisfy a demand for their companionship, but that is inherently exploitative.
Well,
I don't think there's very many ethical breeders, which is why we're
right. I mean, we could get into argument whether breeding simplicior is like is morally permissible, but what I want to drive the point in is that all our interactions, and especially with animals, seem to have some aspects which some downside.
Yeah,
well, they impede on their subjectivity, right? But there's certain
but then they maximize it in other ways.
Well, I mean, in certain way, maybe they maximize our subjective experience, like where we keep dogs in kennels, for example, because if they weren't in kennels, they would tear up your stuff or something like that. But my point is,
then I'd say that might be unjustified.
See, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it seems like a lot of these practices, any interaction with animals is going to infringe upon their subjectivity in some ways, right? And I don't think that that's the only moral consideration. I think that
But I think that's the same with humans, isn't it?
To some extent. I mean, but we have even more. Like we have more. Like again, being a morally relevant agent, being an agent that can. I shouldn't say morally relevant. I apologize. That was the wrong term. A moral agent is somebody who can do right and wrong. Like there are other considerations that we have to put into. So basically, what I'm saying is like if there is this spectrum, if they have more moral duties, which it's kind of funny because like probably like 30 minutes ago we were trying to get into this, but it was difficult because we've jumped around a lot. If we have more moral duties to somebody who's on like this side of the spectrum, there needs to be a delineation why each particular step, like what type of actions are permitted toward each particular step on that kind of ring.
Right.
Like I wouldn't think that we have a moral obligation to alleviate. I don't know. Here, I'll let you talk. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I see what you're going for. But I guess the point is that what I would say is like in any way, like is our interaction or cooperation worth the implicit confliction within interests between agents? Like on a most intuitive scale, there's the fact that our desires will conflict in one or two ways, especially if I'm a murderer and you don't want to get killed. Right. and obviously that's like just a very obvious one, but it happens day to day, and which is why you get in most scenarios, like whether we want the same food or not, and we can only get one one bag of crisps and we want two separate flavors, we're having a moral quandary in a very, very like small way. We're having this ethical contention.
Sure.
Is it worth it? I would say absolutely. Like for example, having a girlfriend who she might want sweet popcorn, I might want salted popcorn. We'll find a compromise. We eat sweet and salted. It's worth it. It's not like, oh, I should get rid of my girlfriend, she wants sweet popcorn. Do you know what I mean? Okay. Like there is certain considerations that are like the downsides that are totally worth the advantages of having ethics and the advantages of having cooperative adventures. I think it's the same with animals. I think that so long as that we are treating animals within a consideration of their interests that seems to outweigh the negative aspects, like for example, like my dog can't walk around the streets, without his lead on because he could, harm others. Does he still want to walk? Yeah, the walk's still good for him. He still wants to have that relationship. He still wants to, experience these things. And I think that overall he can have a positive life, a good life. and
But I mean,
that's
you're
what's
not
been
respecting his interest insofar as you're choking him with the collar, with this like
well,
with this
one,
device.
he's got a
Okay,
he's got
fair enough. We'll say a
harness,
harness.
so-
We'll say a harness. But still, I mean, you're restricting him. You're restricting his subjectivity, what he wants, his desires. And what makes you think that you have that kind of justification? Like, why do you?
Well, I would say for one, for his own well-being, for one, and even the restriction between we restrict ourselves all the time within normative structures, within laws. But I'd say that the restriction within law is not because it's a rational system.
So we should be able
actually
to
offers us
wait a minute, back up.
freedom.
I want you to justify that. So are we allowed to make any laws that restrict somebody's liberty if it would hypothetically raise a chance to have a better life?
I think we should restrict individuals' liberty.
Like drug laws is what I'm thinking.
I don't want to say the
I'm thinking drug laws specifically, right? Like it seems like these things have these things have negative properties, which if you were to use them, they have a unreasonably high chance that they would cause you negative effects on your well-being. And so, do you think that we have an obligation to make laws which restrict the subjectivity's desires in order that we have a greater chance of having an increase of well-being?
Yeah, I'll see where you're getting at. I mean, the one with drugs. I will say that there is a lot more. I'm not going to give a definitive answer of whether drugs should be legal or not. I would say that they probably should be decriminalized at the very least, for one. But then, the reason I'm saying that is essentially because I'm not giving a definitive answer on drugs themselves. I will answer your proper question, which is about whether we should make laws which just restrict freedom. In a second, and you're going to get a horribly Hegelian answer, so be ready for that.
I actually know what you're going to say. I saw your debate yesterday, so I know exactly what you're going to say. Go ahead.
But essentially, the reason I'm not giving a definitive answer on laws, but on drugs particularly, is because we've got the societal impacts, and when you talk about applied ethics, there's so much to be considered. It's not as if we just ban drugs, for example, just because of the individual taking them. There's also the impact upon society and the healthcare system. There's the impact upon the individual's ability to make rational decisions if they are in they take heroin once. Their reasoning may become impaired because they get addicted, and now we'll have this scenario where the individual mightn't be a rational agent anymore, and whether allowing them to continue on that path is justified. And there's so much to be considered.
Well, but the principle is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about
the principle. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify for the audience that I can't if you're wondering my stance on drugs. But in relation to law, I would say that law offers the opportunity for self-determination. It's actually freedom itself, rather than a restriction. I think that the notion of a restriction being purely negative is a very naturalistic notion of freedom, where freedom is essentially the ability to meet one's preferences. And I think that I think Socrates actually does a great job at destroying this in Gorgias, where he basically says is the fool free? When he gets what he wants, and he's not free if he starts suffering, because he never intended for that suffering. So what he's actually free in is when he's rational and right. And so if law is a normative structure which actually represents what is the right thing to do, then the law is actually freeing you, which is why Hegel would say the law purifies your desires. It allows for proper self-determination, but you have to be able to understand the reasoning behind the laws.
Right, but then so your answer is just yes. I mean, essentially. Because your answer is that, okay, we should make laws which maximize well-being, insofar as that would increase real freedom. It just would decrease this kind of simple notion of freedom, right? Like this simplistic notion.
Only if the reasoning was genuinely publicly available, as if the public have agreed and understand the reasons behind it properly.
Democracy.
So a purely democratically justified law.
Why is that necessary though? Because it seems like, obviously we have societies which are not democratically determined, and it seems like if the inferences are made validly anyway, doesn't seem why does everybody have to agree?
Because I would say that it's not necessarily that they have to agree, as in that participation is respected within ethics as being equal. It's not as if they even have to necessarily participate if they chose not to. That's an individual's you don't have to vote, for example. You don't have to do whatever. The point is what I'm saying is that when an individual is not given equal weight to their subjectivity, for example, in what I would say a master-slave relationship, or lordsman and bondsman, employer-employee, socialist kind of rhetoric, then what we see is that the individual's preferences, or the individual's assertions and justifications, the individual's inferences aren't treated with equal weight, and so the conceptualization is actually one-sided and equates to a bias. Which is why you would find institutions which are then biased. You can find I mean, it's not unsurprising that we can find, let's say, if you joined the USSR, in the USSR there was a heavy bias towards the state and towards and the state ethic that was going on. What was justifiable was good for the state in almost a fascist scenario, in a fascistic kind of scenario. We moved towards it actually kind of represents, I think, quite similar to Plato's Republic in this respect. The good of the state over the good of the people. When the whole point is that when you have a universal concept that's being heightened above the particular interests of the individuals and doesn't respect the individual's subjectivity, you've already destroyed the individuals in the first place and the respect for them that it's in trying to do. You're not respecting anything. It's a wishy-washy woo-woo mystic
well, but
thing.
I mean, you could also always come at that
exist.
from like the Platonic perspective, the Platonic that people don't necessarily know what's good for them, that their whole, like, even though that they have these interests, right, that were like, it's a kind of like the whole example where Plato makes he doesn't use this, but I'm trying to think of his specific example, but like when children are voting for the dentist versus the candy man, for example, people don't really know what's good for them, right? Like they think,
and that's actually in Gorgias.
yeah, it's
I
in
think
Gorgias.
that's actually
It is,
yeah.
The thing is that people don't generally know what will maximize their well-being. They just have like these kind of inclinations to fulfill desires, and so like, so the fool essentially, right?
Yeah, it's a criticism of ad populum. But then Plato also makes the mistake, and he thinks that, like, for example, the philosopher, when he climbs out the cave, is able to see truth, but then is unable to report upon it. The point is that the philosopher wouldn't know what he was seeing was the truth unless he was able to speak of it and able to report on it, in which people were able to actually verify or falsify his inferences in the first place. So
you can't say that Plato did that. Plato thinks that obviously he has a completely different ontology, right? His theory is that you have to experience the good in order to even have knowledge of it, like, and you can't convey that because in order to have the good, you have to have knowledge of the good already, right? Like it's like this.
I'm not saying Plato thought that. I'm saying Plato made a mistake in thinking that. Yeah. I think
I'm just saying Plato is wrong. No. Haven't you ever read the quote? All philosophy is just a history. Is just a series of footnotes to Plato.
Yeah, you probably think. He has actually raised pretty much every philosophical question to date, pretty much. But I think the reason I'm criticizing Plato is, like, in this respect, is because he wouldn't know if he was moving from one illusion to the truth when he could be moving from an illusion to another illusion.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just another room in the cave.
I mean, you would disagree, but I don't know if we should really get into Platonic
metaphysics.
He would definitely disagree. I don't know if we should get into Platonics. I'm gonna have to pull some Platonists on you. But
we might. Maybe this is a good time to start to transition. So maybe if you guys want to take a few minutes to summarize, kind of draw together the threads from the discussion with some kind of flexible closings, and then we will go into the Q&A. So folks, if you have a question, fire it into the old live chat and we will read through those. Thanks so much, and back to you guys.
So do you want to wrap up first, or do you want me to wrap up? It's your decision.
I'm happy to go.
Sure, yeah, and then I'll just wrap up.
I will say, like, I am really sorry to the crowd, but we really got into, like, there was a lot of metaphysics here. And we never really left metaphysics that much. Like, a little bit of ethics, and then went straight back. I suppose is what I would say is, I guess that, like, from my understanding, like, I haven't really grasped your position so much within this. Because it seems to me that you agree that, it seems that the only thing that you would be saying that I am not is that morally relevant features in reality can exist beyond the qualia and the actual qualitative experience, and can exist within the rational decision-making process, and rational agency is therefore more valuable, or the only thing that is valuable, or more valuable to a greater extent even, so that, like, anthropocentric value overtakes sentient values. I would obviously deny that. I would say that the existence of anthropocentric value and the value of rationality is not intrinsic, but is instead extrinsic. It is instrumental. The value of reason isn't rational agents. I don't value rational agents because they are rational. I value them because they are agents, and then I treat them differently because they are rational. I respect their agency and their subjectivity, and their rationality modifies that. but it doesn't give them anything that is inherently more valuable. The value itself would still be in the experience, in the qualia, in the qualitative judgments that they experience themselves. It wouldn't be in the rational decision-making processes, because otherwise then we would be saying that their inferences themselves are what are valuable, not the agents. So, and then I would say that obviously animals are capable of a qualitative experience, and since that's what we are considering within ethics, then we should be applying that to animals. We should be considering their interests with equal weight to our own, within reference to our duties and obligations to the other. So our societies will understand how to respect other individuals to a greater and greater degree. And I think the first thing that we could do is just stop eating them. I think that considering the most interactions we have with animals is on our dinner plates, on our plates, then what we realize is that actually what we are doing on a day-to-day basis is massacring millions and millions of sentient creatures who are having a qualitative experience, who feel pain, who suffer, who do not want to die. And when they do die, that is a moral travesty. And we are committing this genocide, I would say, or even I would, in many ways, I think vegans get criticized for this, but I would say it's an equivalent to a Holocaust in the sense of what we are doing. It is a moral, it is an ethical calamity that we are committing against these animals, billions and billions of animals every year. And so, in so much that we are respecting qualitative experience, in that we are respecting subjects, in that we are respecting individuals themselves, we should start by just not eating them. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I appreciate Lewis for coming on. I think that this is actually the most... It's funny because I think that this is the most debate where we talked about veganism the least, yet we also it was the most interesting for me personally, unfortunately. So I apologize to the crowd that we dived into metaphysics so hard. It just was particularly relevant to his particular view of veganism. It's very different than like something from Alex or something different from Isaac's view. So I wanted to dive into the particulars because I wanted to develop a critique that would be sufficient on his terms. Unfortunately, we don't really have the time for that, but I'm going to give him kind of what my thoughts are on his position, and I'll just kind of give wrapping up thoughts about what I think about this overall. So I think that, so obviously, his position is that qualia is the morally relevant trait, and it's the only possible morally relevant trait for him. Obviously, it's interesting. He says like that the agents are what's valuable. It's a subjectivity, and it's interesting because there's this distinction of what does the word agent come from? It comes from agere. It comes from agens. It's just something which does something else. So like ultimately, if you think that essence are within the fabric of nature itself, everything is an agent in some sense. I mean, that it acts in some way. But we don't really have time to get into that. Obviously, he thinks that, and he wanted me to articulate a little bit of my position. I think that there is value of having a subjectivity, having some kind of qualitative experience. I just think there's more things that are relevant. And I think that there's this scale of value. I think that if you have, so what I didn't really get to articulate is if you have these rational considerations, you're a moral agent, you have obligations that are not applied to the lesser animals that don't have that. And furthermore, as you go up, like if you have psychophysical continuance, and obviously he doesn't like that. He doesn't like identity, and I kind of understand why. It's an interesting position. I'd have to go with him more on that and talk about identity. But if you have some of these characteristics, like you get more moral consideration because these things are particularly relevant. I just don't think that having subjectivity in of itself is valuable. And he touched on this in his closing statement. He said they don't want to die. And I think that there are some beings which are sentient, have some kind of qualitative experience. That is, they have some kind of underlying neurology. And I'm thinking particularly about like crustaceans, where they have some like level of neurology, but I don't think that they have any qualitative real experience. Or well, I shouldn't say that. I should say that I don't think that they have any experience that's like ours, certainly, and definitely not desires, not beliefs, not anything like that. I don't think that they're morally relevant. I think that you need more than qualitative experience. You need to have beliefs or desires or like something else. I think there's a lot of different things. Now, what does that mean? That means that at least some forms of non-veganism are permissible. And again, it depends on what your definition of veganism is, what you think that qualifies as that. And I also think that, in something we didn't get to touch too much on, I don't think that a lot of the things that vegans are against really harm animals in a significant way. I think that they are... he talks about this in his this is actually for their well-being, then maybe this actually increases their well-being in some ways. I think that there are certain products that the animal industry does, and I'm not talking about chicken or beef or veal or something like that. I'm talking about maybe honey, talking about certain other practices that are in the animal industry that do maximize the well-being of certain animals. Obviously, we didn't really get a chance to touch on that. I apologize, but I think that I would love to continue this conversation. I think that we're really get deep into some of these issues, and maybe on your channel or something like that.
Yeah, I'd happily have a follow-up, especially since I think that we could get into the more applied side.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like, whether there could be an industry which is beneficial to the animals themselves and have perhaps a symbiotic relationship with animals, maybe bees, for example. Mm-hmm. Or whether, like practices like, like, for example, was it tail docking are justified because it's overall, quote unquote, for the welfare of the animal.
Or artificial insemination, right? Because if
Yeah, we'll definitely argue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're relevant topics, right? I mean.
Yeah, they're relevant. Yeah, they absolutely are. Yeah, definitely. I'd love to have a follow-up.
Awesome. Thanks so much, gentlemen. It's been a true pleasure. I think people really enjoyed this in the live chat. Nothing but good feedback. So really fun. And with that, we will jump into these questions. So first up, got a short list, but we appreciate all these questions, folks. It's always fun. Jens Van, let me know if I don't pronounce this right. Is it Brookhoven? Let me know. Thanks for your super chat, who said, "This chat is making me a vegan." I don't know if they're referring to the live chat or the video chat, but thanks for sharing that, Jens. We're glad you're here, and thanks so much for your question from Tomato, who asks, question for Sterling: would it be possible for an animal to demonstrate a capacity for moral reasoning without language? Have you explored their complex behaviors?
So I do think I kind of agree with Lewis in the sense that language is necessary to convey rational information. But I think that there could be ways that are non-syntactic to communicate language. So it's possible, like if they had more reasoning, they could communicate it. And I have dived into the literature. And I'm definitely not convinced they have any kind of moral reasoning, even if they have altruistic behavior. But yeah, so I mean, no, I don't think that they do, in fact, but I think it's maybe possible.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And that is actually for today. So, but people, I can tell you, people have been giving really positive feedback. I think they just really enjoyed it. It's kind of a calming way to start your Sunday, a friendly conversation rather than the blood sports that sometimes happen. So, want to say thanks so much, folks. I have got to remind you, folks, if you're listening and you're like, I like that, and you want to hear more, there is plenty more to hear where that came from each of these guys. I put their links in the description so that you can click on their links and hear more at their own channels. And also want to say, we just really appreciate you hanging out here, folks. It's always a pleasure. We know that you guys, there are a lot of channels to hang out at, but we just appreciate you spending time here. It's always a fun community. And so with that, want to say thanks. One last final thanks to both Sterling and Lewis. Thanks so much for being here, guys. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you, both of you. I really appreciate, obviously, you having me on hosting, and obviously I appreciate you, Sterling, for some good critique. And we'll get you there eventually. You'll be vegan by the end of it. Don't worry, man.
Maybe. But thank you. No, thank you, James.
So,
I appreciate you having me on again.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure. So with that, folks, take care. Have a great rest of your weekend. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care.